Ned Stark leaned on his makeshift crutch, surveying the riverside battlefield in the aftermath of the North's surprise victory against Jaime Lannister's host. The morning sun stretched over a land marred by smoke and carnage. Dead and dying men littered among the wreckage of tents and siege equipment. Crows swooped overhead, their caws mingling with the groans of the wounded. A sour wind blew from the direction of Riverrun, carrying the tang of charred wood. Jon Snow stood near Ned, a hand pressed to the shallow cut at his flank, though he tried not to show how much pain it caused him. His breathing was ragged from both battle and exhilaration. The captains of the Stark and Tully forces were busy collecting prisoners, binding their hands, and corralling them in a makeshift enclosure by the riverbank. Nearby, gray wind prowled, muzzle stained with blood, watching for any Lannister man who might think to resist. Ser Roderick Castle rode up, dusted with ash and sweat, his face grim. "My lord," he said to Ned, "we have the bulk of the Lannister survivors rounded up near those burnt-out siege towers. Some tried to flee south, others scattered west. We haven't the mounts to chase them all." Ned dipped his head. "We'll let the stragglers go. Let them carry word of their defeat if they must. We've enough on our hands here." "Yes, my lord," Ser Roderick said. "I've sent men to put out the fires in the siege camp. The castle folk from Riverrun are aiding us. Shall I organize a triage for our wounded?" "Do it at once," Ned said. "We'll set up tents near that line of poplars, away from the worst of the smoke. And we need to keep watch in case Tywin Lannister's host is nearby." Roderick inclined his head and rode off to carry out the orders. Jon tugged at Ned's sleeve. "Father," he said under his breath, "you must let Maester Vyman tend your wound. You can barely stand." Ned's jaw clenched at the pain, but he nodded. "Soon. First, the men." His gaze shifted across the field, taking in the battered forms of Northern and Riverland soldiers stooping to help friends or to finish off enemies too wounded to stand. "War spares no one," Ned murmured. "We've paid a heavy price for this victory." They moved down the slope with care. Jon steadied Ned when his leg threatened to buckle. The older man's face was sheened with sweat, tight with pain, but his eyes were determined. Some of the Stark guards, seeing them approach, rushed forward to offer support. Ned waved them off, hobbling slowly, as though punishing himself by refusing ease. He spoke briefly to each cluster of wounded men, thanking them for their valor or offering a quiet word of comfort for the dying. Jon watched how the men, even in their misery, found solace in Ned's calm presence. He realized anew that many of them had marched all this way for the sake of House Stark. Indeed, for the sake of Ned's leadership. They came upon a grievously injured Karstark soldier whose mail was torn open. 3 arrow shafts protruded from his ribs. He feebly tried to rise upon seeing Ned. Ned knelt, ignoring the sharp protest of his thigh. "Rest," Ned told the man gently. "You fought bravely. Your lord will know of it." Tears leaked from the soldier's eyes. "My lord, I can't feel my legs." Ned pressed a hand to the soldier's shoulder, his face grave. "We'll send a maester. Hold on as best you can." But Jon could see that the man's life was bleeding away, evident in the chalky pallor of his lips. The soldier's eyes drifted shut in a silent acceptance of doom. A retainer with bandages hurried by, and Ned motioned for them to tend this man if possible. As they continued on, Jon's throat felt tight. So many dead for one battle, but they had captured Jaime Lannister, a prize that might shift the balance of the entire war. Not far off, Robb Stark had taken control of the western quadrant of the battlefield. He sat astride a freckled courser, conferring with Brynden Blackfish Tully. Around them, a ring of Karstark, Umber, and Bolton men guarded their most valuable prisoner. Jaime Lannister, stripped of his golden armor, his hands bound behind his back. His hair was lank with sweat, and blood streaked the side of his face where he'd been struck by a pommel. Even so, Jaime managed to look defiant, scornful even, scanning the Starks with a sneer curling his lip. Ned and Jon approached, accompanied by Arya, who had somehow slipped free from her keepers again. She trailed a few paces behind, eyes flicking warily to the prisoners. Gray Wind stood near Robb, ears twitching, muzzle still stained. Jon felt a flicker of unease about Arya being so close to the aftermath of battle, but she was too stubborn to be sent away now. As they drew up, Robb turned in the saddle, relief flashing in his eyes when he saw Ned. "Father, you're on your feet. You should be resting." "I will," Ned said with a weary smile. "After I see to certain matters." Jaime Lannister, upon spotting Ned, spat at the ground. "Stark," he said, voice dripping contempt. "Last I heard, you were rotting in the Red Keep. You're as persistent as a cockroach." Arya bristled, stepping forward, but Ned moved a crutch in front of her to still her. He regarded Jaime. "You lost," Ned said simply. "I advise you to keep a civil tongue, Ser Jaime." Jaime narrowed his eyes. "You have me at your mercy, that much is clear. Are you any better than your friend Robert, though? He'd have hacked me to pieces or had me kneel in front of his court. Perhaps you plan the same." He glanced scornfully at Jon, remembering their brief clash. "Or let your bastard do the honors?" Jon's face colored, and he put a hand on his sword hilt. Jaime noticed and let out a mirthless chuckle. "Come now, boy, you're not half bad with that blade for a mongrel. I'll grant you that." "That is enough," Ned said, his voice low and quiet, but the threat in it was unmistakable. Jaime, reading that cool anger, said no more. "Robb," Ned continued, shifting his weight on the crutch, "we cannot linger here long. Tywin's forces may be near. We should gather the prisoners, see to our wounded, and make for Riverrun. The castle has enough space and supplies to house them. Ser Jaime will need to be guarded at all times. We won't get a more valuable hostage than him." Robb gave a sharp nod. "Agreed. We'll march as soon as the battlefield is secure and the dead are handled. I'll see to it that Ser Jaime is well guarded. The men already speak of exchanging him for Sansa or for peace, but I suspect the Lannisters won't yield so easily." Ned's face tightened. He remembered how Sansa had been left behind at King's Landing, presumably still captive to the Lannisters. The thought pressed on him like a blade to the heart. "We'll see about negotiations," Ned said. "For now, the Kingslayer lives. Perhaps that will gain us some leverage with the Boy King and his mother." Arya scowled at Jaime but said nothing further. Robb ordered a handful of men to escort Jaime away. The Kingslayer walked on unsteady feet, flanked by tall, stern-faced northerners with spears. Before he vanished from view, Jaime shot a final smirk at Jon, as if to say their duel was unfinished. Jon bristled, but Ned laid a hand on his shoulder. "Let him brood," Ned said quietly. "He's caged now." Jon nodded. He realized that his side was burning with renewed pain, and he pressed a palm over the blood-soaked cloth. Ned noticed and called over one of the Tully medics. "Tend my son's wound," Ned ordered. "Then send him to the triage tents." Robb dismounted to assist with overseeing the prisoner roundup. Brynden Tully urged more men to clear away the half-built siege towers. Arya followed Ned and Jon toward a cluster of tents near the poplars, where banners of the direwolf and the trout hung limp in the still air. There, the medics were gathering wounded, while the stench of blood, waste, and sweat thickened. Arya's expression turned sickly at the sight. Men cried out for water or mercy. A Tully soldier poured wine into a gash in another's arm to clean it, eliciting a tortured howl. Ned, leaning on his crutch, directed a stable hand to help him unbuckle the bracer on his left arm so the maester could check his own splinted leg. Jon stood quietly, letting a medic cut away the ragged cloth at his flank to examine the shallow cut. Arya hovered, biting her lip. Jon could see the horror in her eyes. This was not the training yard. It was war in all its grim finality. She had insisted on coming, but the experience was clearly shaking her. Maester Vyman, who had accompanied them from Riverrun, arrived to check Ned's leg. He gently peeled back the bandages. The flesh around the stitches was red and inflamed but not festering like before. Ned winced as the maester applied a fresh poultice of herbs. "You must stay off this for at least a week, Lord Stark," Vyman warned. "You've strained it too much already." "I know," Ned said softly, glancing at his daughter. "But I fear the realm won't spare me the time I need." Jon tensed as the medic poked the edges of his wound with a metal probe, testing for hidden debris. He sucked in a breath at the sharp sting. The medic muttered something about it being a clean slice, then stitched it up with quick, practiced motions. Arya grimaced at the sight of the needle and thread going in and out of Jon's flesh. After it was done, the medic splashed on a stinging solution to disinfect. Jon hissed but tried not to flinch. "There," the medic said. "You'll have a scar, but you'll live." Jon exhaled. "Thank you." Arya moved closer, tentatively resting a hand on Jon's forearm. "You fought bravely," she said in a small voice. "I saw part of it. You saved Father." "Or tried," Jon murmured. "Father can handle himself, but Jaime Lannister is a deadly foe." Arya's eyes flicked down. "Don't do something so reckless next time. If you died—" She broke off, swallowing. Jon ruffled her hair gently. "We can't promise not to be reckless in war, but I'll do my best to stay alive, Aerie." Ned watched their exchange with paternal affection, though worry lingered behind his gaze. When Maester Vyman finished changing his bandages, Ned shifted to address Arya. "Your mother will want to know you're safe," he said. "She and your brother have parted ways for now. Catelyn remains at the crossing to finalize certain dealings with Lord Walder Frey, ensuring the twins hold no further demands. She'll be here soon." Arya nodded but said nothing, still staring at the wounded men around her. Ned extended a hand. "Come, let's step away. I want you to breathe some fresh air." They moved from the triage tents to a calmer section of the battlefield where the smell of blood was less overpowering. Hallis Malin and a dozen Stark guards were posted there, along with tethered horses. Workers had begun stacking Lannister arms and armor in mounds, spoils of war to be redistributed or melted down. A few knights from minor northern houses scoured the camp for any remaining pockets of resistance. Just then, Robb approached, flanked by the great Jon Umber, an enormous man with a wild beard, and Lord Roose Bolton, pale and watchful. Robb greeted Ned with a concerned nod. "Father, the Lannisters are thoroughly routed. Their siege lines are undone. Riverrun's gates are open. The Blackfish suggests we move our host inside the castle to regroup." He paused, his face grimy with battle sweat, but eyes alight with the afterglow of triumph. "We've done it, Father. We have Jaime Lannister." Ned nodded. "You've done well, Robb. Now we must see how to use this advantage." "Tywin won't be pleased." At the mention of Tywin, Roose Bolton's face shifted, a flicker of something unreadable in his cold eyes. "Lord Tywin still commands a considerable army, rumored to be encamped near Harrenhal or the Golden Tooth. He might come east in revenge. We should prepare the castle's defenses." The great Jon rumbled. "Let him come." The lions roared and we answered. "We'll throw them in the river again." Robb tried to hide a wry smile. "Easy, great Jon. We can't get careless. For now, let's see to Riverrun." "Father, can you ride the short distance there?" Ned frowned, testing his weight on the crutch. "If I must, I'll manage with help." Hallis Malin stepped forward. "We'll get you a litter, my lord. There's no shame in it. You're wounded." Ned drew a breath, about to refuse, but Arya looked at him with such a mixture of worry and hope that he relented. "Very well," Ned said quietly. "A litter, then. Jon, Robb, go on ahead with your men. Secure the castle. I'll follow." Robb glanced to Jon and Jon nodded. "I'll escort Father in the litter," Jon said. "Then we'll catch up." Arya piped up, "I'll ride with you, Father." Ned cast her a thoughtful look but did not gainsay her. In truth, he was probably reluctant to let her out of his sight, especially with so much chaos still stirring. "All right," Ned said, "but stay close." Hallis barked orders to the men, who quickly rigged a simple litter, a stout plank mounted on two long poles, which could be hitched behind a sturdy horse at a slow pace. Ned was helped onto it, biting back a groan as his leg twinged. Arya climbed up beside him, providing a small measure of comfort. Jon watched, tension in his gut. His father was pushing himself too soon, too hard. But with a war on, they lacked time for convalescence. When the litter was ready, they set forth along the bank of the Red Fork. Robb led the main host in columns, bearing the banners of House Stark, House Tully, and the lesser northern lords. Wagons carried their wounded and their provisions. Prisoners, including Jaime Lannister, were corralled under heavy guard. The battered remains of Jaime's men shuffled in sullen ranks, stripped of armor. Some northern soldiers muttered that Jaime should be hanged or thrown in a dungeon, but Ned's order was clear: treat him well enough that he could be exchanged, if the need arose. Riverrun's walls rose majestically as they approached, the afternoon sun turning the river water to molten copper. Guards atop the battlements cheered at the sight of the triumphant force. The drawbridge was already lowered, and the portcullis stood open, courtesy of the Blackfish and the Tully garrison who had aided from inside. Once across, the soldiers spread into the wide outer yard, forming up in rough lines. Arya peered from the litter with curiosity. She'd been here before, but never in the thick of war. Riverrun was a triangular fortress, built at the meeting of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone. 2 rivers flanked it, making siege difficult. Inside the main yard, banners of the leaping trout hung next to stark gray direwolves. Catelyn Stark was absent, still at the Twins, but many Tully retainers bustled about, offering water, bread, and hospitality to their allies. Ned was gingerly helped down from the litter. He leaned on his crutch, wincing. Jon hovered protectively, while Arya hopped to the ground and tried to make herself useful. Servants hustled them into the great hall, a high-ceilinged chamber with tall windows. The windows had been boarded partly shut during the siege, but now they stood open to let in fresh air. Light pooled on the stone floor. Some of the Tully men cheered upon seeing Ned and the victor's banners, though the mood was tempered by the knowledge that many had died outside the walls. Ser Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, awaited them. He embraced Ned carefully, mindful of the wounded leg. "My lord nephew," Brynden said, "we owe you thanks for lifting the siege. Riverrun stands thanks to the swift assault." "You owe more thanks to Robb," Ned corrected. He planned the double envelopment and surprised Jaime's lines. Bryndon's eyes lit with pride as he looked at Robb. "Indeed, we might call him the Young Wolf, a name to put fear into the Lannisters." Robb flushed, murmuring that it was a group effort. But the men in the hall took up the cry, clashing swords on shields, chanting "Young Wolf," with a mixture of gratitude and excitement. Jon watched as Robb tried to maintain humility, though a spark in Robb's eye suggested he felt the pride of a commander whose plan had succeeded. Jon too felt a stirring of admiration for his foster brother. The weight of that victory fell on Robb's shoulders, and he had not disappointed. As the cheers subsided, Brynden led them deeper into the keep, where Ned could rest. Once again, Ned was settled into the same bedchamber he'd occupied during his feverish days. This time, though, he had more strength and peace of mind. Arya perched on a stool at his side. Jon helped the maester remove Ned's armor, pauldron by pauldron, so the older man could lie back on the linen sheets. Outside the chamber, the clamor of the castle was relentless. Men calling orders, blacksmiths hammering, wounded groaning. The stench of unwashed bodies drifted in even here. Brynden had already issued instructions for the Tully cooks to prepare a feast of sorts to celebrate the victory. Yet everyone knew it was but the first step in a long campaign. "Jon," Ned said softly, once the door had closed on the hustle and bustle, "tell me the truth. How bad is your injury?" Jon swallowed. "The medic stitched it. It's shallow. I'll be fine." Ned nodded, relief flickering. "Good. We must remain vigilant. Capturing Jaime was a triumph, but Tywin Lannister will not stand idle." He glanced at Arya. "You will stay close to Maester Vyman or to Jon when I cannot watch you. Is that clear?" Arya pouted but agreed. "Yes, father." "Good. Now go on, find some supper. Let me speak with Jon in private." She hesitated, glancing between them, but then slipped away, the door closing behind her. Jon could hear her footsteps fade down the corridor. He turned back to Ned, bracing for a serious discussion. Ned's eyes rested on Jon. "How many men did we lose out there? Do you know?" Jon shook his head. "I only know it was many. We haven't gotten a full count yet." Ned exhaled. "And Ser Jaime? Did he say anything else about Sansa before you arrived?" Jon frowned. "No. He seemed more interested in taunting us. But I suspect we have leverage. If the Lannisters want Jaime free, they might release Sansa." Ned's face was clouded with worry. "I fear for her safety. The Queen is cunning, and Joffrey, well, he's proven himself cruel. Sansa must be terrified or worse, used as a pawn in their game." Jon bowed his head. He remembered Sansa's tears back in King's Landing, her fear of Joffrey. "We'll get her back," Jon said firmly. "I pray so," Ned murmured, "and hope we can do so without more bloodshed. But we must be realistic. War has begun, and the Boy King is under Cersei's sway. She may do anything to keep power." Then he sighed, pressing 2 fingers to his brow. "What of the secret, Jon? Has anyone shown signs of guessing?" Jon hesitated, recalling glimpses of suspicion from Edric Dane at Harrenhal, or the searching looks from Baelish in King's Landing. "No one has confronted me. The only ones who know for certain are you, me, a few of our closest kin, and the king, or rather the late King Robert. But he's gone." Ned's face tightened at the memory. "Robert's secrets died with him. I doubt Cersei or Joffrey realize who you truly are. If they did, they'd have tried to kill you by now or hold you hostage. For the moment, the realm sees you as Ned Stark's bastard. And ironically, that might be your safest shield." Jon nodded. He'd had this conversation with Ned before, but every time, the reality of it struck him anew. The knowledge that he was Rhaegar Targaryen's son, and Lyanna Stark's, weighed on him like chainmail he couldn't remove, especially after facing Jaime on the battlefield, the same Kingslayer who'd served Rhaegar's father Aerys in the Kingsguard before betraying him. The webs of old wars were tangled indeed. Ned closed his eyes, exhaustion overtaking him. "Jon, we will speak more on this. But for now, guard your tongue, guard your life. The realm is in chaos. One day, when peace returns, we will see if revealing the truth serves any purpose." Jon bowed his head. "Yes, father." Ned drifted off, seduced by fatigue and the lingering pain in his leg. Jon stood there in the half-lit room, hearing the muffled bustle of Riverrun beyond the walls. After a time, he left quietly, asking a guard to remain outside Ned's door. He wandered down the corridor in search of Arya and a hot meal. He passed through a gallery that overlooked the courtyard, where lines of captured Lannister men knelt under guard. Some cursed the Starks, others moaned for mercy. Horses were being stabled in every available corner of the fortress, feed running short. Jon saw Robb across the yard, deep in discussion with the Blackfish. They stood near a group of men bearing the scythe sigil of House Hayford, once loyal to the Targaryens generations ago, but now just another house in the Riverlands. The talk looked tense. Jon supposed it was about how to handle the upcoming moves of Tywin's main army. He found Arya near one of the smaller gates to the yard, staring through the bars at Jaime Lannister, who was locked in a small iron kennel for the moment. The kennel was typically used to hold ferocious dogs or perhaps a captured foe for a short time. Jaime sat inside, hands still bound, leaning against the bars. A half-lamp hung overhead, casting him in an orange glow. Arya glared at him with pure loathing. "You shouldn't be here, Arya," Jon said quietly, stepping up to her. She jumped, then scowled at him. "I just wanted to look at him. He's the one who crippled Bran, isn't he?" Jon recalled the rumors that Jaime had pushed Bran from a tower window, back in Winterfell. It was never proven outright, but Ned suspected as much, and so did Catelyn. "He denies it, but we all believe it to be true," Jon said softly. Arya's jaw tightened. "I want him to pay for that." She reached down to the hilt of the sword she called Needle. Jon gently put his hand on hers. "He might pay in time," Jon said, "but that's not for you to decide now. Father wants him alive as a hostage. Come on, let's find some food." Reluctantly, Arya let him guide her away. Jaime's sneering gaze followed them, though he said nothing. Past the gate, they reached a corridor lined with servants carrying trays. The smell of roasted onions and turnips made Jon's stomach growl, though he felt a knot of queasiness left over from the battle. Arya didn't speak until they found themselves in a small side hall, where a few wooden tables were set up for knights off duty. They shared a bowl of hearty stew, mopping up the broth with crusty bread. Arya picked at hers, appetite subdued. Jon forced himself to eat. He knew he needed strength to recover from the day's fighting. In the corner, a group of Northmen laughed raucously, toasting to the young wolf. Another table held Tully knights who drank in grim silence, mourning fallen friends. "What if the Lannisters come for us again?" Arya asked softly, swirling a piece of bread in her stew. "We can't fight them forever." Jon thought of Tywin's cold, calculating face. "We'll fight as long as it takes. If Father's plan works, maybe we can exchange Jaime for Sansa or for peace. Maybe Tywin will yield." Arya's eyes flickered. "He won't. They never yield." Jon nodded, swallowing. "You're probably right, but we have to try. War is... I don't want to see more fields of corpses, more men screaming." Her face twisted with the memory. Then she huddled over her stew. "I just want to go home." Jon wanted to promise that they would, but he couldn't say when. Instead, he gently touched her wrist, offering silent reassurance. She shook him off, turning back to her meal, but her eyes brimmed with emotion. They finished eating. Soon after, Robb found them and beckoned Jon away to talk strategy. Arya returned to Ned's chamber, presumably. Jon followed Robb through a labyrinth of corridors until they reached a private solar that overlooked the confluence of the rivers. The Great Jon was already there, along with Roose Bolton, Ser Roderick Castle, Brynden Tully, and several other commanders. A large candlelit table displayed a rough map of the region, scratched parchment pinned by daggers. "We were just discussing Tywin's next move," Robb said, gesturing for Jon to join them. "Roose Bolton believes Tywin will strike from the west, aiming to relieve Jaime if he didn't know Jaime was captured. Now that he learns Jaime's in our hands, Tywin might attempt a rescue or shift his focus to the south." Roose's voice was quiet, oddly calm. "Lord Tywin is no fool. He may attempt to threaten the Riverlands further, to force us to ransom Jaime quickly. Or he could march on the twins to sever our supply lines. Hard to say." The Great Jon slammed a fist on the table, rattling the daggers that pinned the map. "Let him come. We'll smash him, the same as we did his golden boy." Brynden Tully shook his head. "My friend, Tywin's host is rumored to be double our size. Our success depended on surprise and dividing their forces. If Tywin comes in full strength, we must be prepared to defend or outmaneuver him." Ser Roderick stroked his white side whiskers. "With Harrenhal in Lannister hands, they have a formidable base. But Tywin might want to draw us out rather than try to storm Riverrun." Robb frowned, leaning over the map. "If we wait for him here, we might get bottled up in a siege ourselves. That's no good, especially if the Lannisters hold Sansa. We can't abandon her. Father and I have considered sending envoys under flag of truce to King's Landing, offering to exchange Jaime for my sister, and perhaps for an end to hostilities if King Joffrey will relent." A few men scoffed. Lord Bolton's lips thinned. "King Joffrey is a vicious boy. Cersei rules him from behind the curtain. She'd only be moved if she fears losing Jaime for good." Brynden Tully nodded. "But we must be careful not to appear too eager. We have the advantage. The more desperate they believe we are, the less they'll concede." Robb raked a hand through his auburn hair. "So we hold Jaime, we hold Riverrun, and we see what Tywin does. Meanwhile, we can send ravens to King's Landing, stating our terms. Free Sansa. Recognize the North's right to rule itself or at least to withdraw from the conflict. Return Ned Stark's name to honor. Possibly even set Arya's future in stone. If the Lannisters reject it, we keep Jaime. If they threaten to harm Sansa, we vow to do the same to Jaime, though that's no outcome we want." The men around the table exchanged looks. Bolton's expression was unreadable. The Great Jon gave a loud harumph, and Brynden Tully pursed his lips. It was dangerous to threaten Jaime's life, But that was the reality of hostages in this war. Jon stood quietly, absorbing it. Finally, he cleared his throat. If Tywin marches east in anger, we'll need to be ready to fight again. But we're still battered. Father needs time to recover, as do many of our men. That might force Tywin to come quickly before we regroup. Roose Bolton gave Jon a long look. A keen observation, Snow. We should accelerate our preparations. Let the men rest for a day or two, bury the dead, mend armor, then begin fortifying. If Tywin tries to cross the Red Fork, we can meet him near the fords. If that fails, we retreat to Riverrun's walls. We do not let ourselves be trapped in open terrain. Brynden Tully concurred. Agreed. My nephew Edmure is still on the mend from earlier battles, but I'll see that all Tully banners remain at the ready. And we have your father's presence. Wounded or not, Ned Stark's leadership will steady the men. They respect him, and they follow you, Robb, as they've clearly shown. Robb looked uncertain for a moment, then he straightened. All right, we'll do as we said. I'll draft a letter to King's Landing, stating our terms. I'll also reach out to the Freys and to the Mallisters, who guard the coast, to see if they'll send more men. Meanwhile, we watch for Tywin. That is our plan. No one disagreed. The meeting broke up, men dispersing to carry out tasks. The Great Jon boomed his approval of the plan, though it lacked the immediate smashing of foes he seemed to crave. Bolton gave Robb a small nod and glided away like a pale shadow. Brynden patted Robb's shoulder. You're doing well, lad, he said, then left. Ser Roderick lingered a moment, murmuring that he would check on Ned before stepping out. At last, only Robb and Jon remained in the solar. Outside, the corridor buzzed with activity. Guards passing, servants hurrying with trays of bandages or kettles of stew. Robb leaned against the table, exhaling heavily. You all right? Jon asked. Robb shrugged. It's a lot. The men are calling me the young wolf. I'm not sure if I'm that boy or if I'm just faking confidence so they don't see my fears. I keep thinking about how many died out there today. Some are men I've known my whole life. Jon stepped closer. You had to command. You gave them a victory. You can mourn the dead, but don't blame yourself for their loss. War forced your hand. Robb nodded slowly, jaw tight. Father always said war is monstrous. I never truly understood until now. He let out a sharp breath, then mustered a half-smile. Thank you for watching over him out there. I know you risked your life fighting Jaime. Father told me about it. Jon shook his head. He would have done the same for me, and he nearly got himself killed fighting Jaime after I was too slow to match the Kingslayer's skill. No one here expects you to defeat Jaime Lannister easily, Robb said, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. But you kept Father from being skewered. That's enough. Now try to get some rest. We'll need you tomorrow. Jon managed a grim smile. Yes, I'm sure we'll have more duties to see to. They parted ways, Robb going to finalize the letter to King's Landing. Jon wandered back through the labyrinth of corridors, mentally replaying the duel with Jaime. His swift, precise strikes, the taunts. A Targaryen in secret, fighting the Kingslayer. Life had become more tangled than any dream he'd ever imagined in Winterfell's quiet courtyards. Eventually, Jon found himself in one of the castle's smaller courtyards, open to the night sky. The sun had set, and lanterns cast flickering pools of light on the cobblestones. Soldiers and servants moved in subdued clusters. From somewhere distant, he heard a woman singing a lament for the fallen, her voice carrying a strange, mournful beauty. A sense of sorrow weighed on the castle. Victory or not, many would not return to their homes. He stood by a low stone wall, gazing at the dark waters below where the two rivers merged. If he looked farther west, he might imagine Tywin's great army stirring, or across the south, the memory of King's Landing, a nest of vipers. He could still taste the dread from those days, the secret that burned in his chest. Rhaegar's son. If the realm knew, they might brand him a pretender, or worship him as a rightful heir, or just try to kill him out of fear of Targaryen madness. None of it was what Jon wanted. He was loyal to Ned Stark and to the North, But fate cared little for personal desires. A soft voice startled him. "You look haunted," said Arya, stepping from the shadows near the archway. She wore a simple tunic and breeches, her hair in tangles. Jon turned. "Couldn't sleep?" Arya shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see men lying dead, or I see that hateful Kingslayer's face, or I think of Bran, stuck in that bed in Winterfell because of Jaime, or Sansa, held in King's Landing with those snakes." Jon exhaled. "We'll get Sansa back. We'll see Bran again. You must have faith." Arya edged closer, arms folded across her chest. "It's just, everything feels broken. Life used to be simple in Winterfell, lessons, training, hearing the wind in the Godswood. Now everything's about war, secrets, hostages. Father's hurt and you nearly died. Robb is burdened with command. I hate it all." Jon wished he had a comforting lie or even a gentle truth. "I know," he said quietly. "I miss Winterfell too." She looked up at him, eyes glimmering in the lantern light. "If the war ends, do you think we can all go home again?" He hesitated. "Maybe. Sometimes wars end with a great many dead and the victors imposing terms. If we win, Winterfell will stand. If we lose—" He trailed off, not wanting to voice the worst outcome. Arya's gaze hardened. "We can't lose. We're Starks. We have wolves in our hearts." Then, in a quieter voice, "But I'm scared." Jon's chest tightened. He reached out and ruffled her hair gently. "It's all right to be scared, Aerie. Everyone is, even Robb, even Father. Courage is doing what must be done despite fear." She nodded, biting her lip. "Don't let them send me away to some southern place for safety. I want to stay here with you and Father." Jon thought of the vow Ned made about not risking Arya's life, but he also knew how fiercely she would resist being sheltered. He sighed. "Just stay close. Don't wander alone. War isn't a game." He paused. "We'll see how Father decides, but I doubt he wants to let you out of his sight anyway." She let out a sigh that might have been relief, then rested her head briefly on his shoulder, in a rare moment of open affection. "Thank you, Jon," she murmured. They stood that way for a breath or two, listening to the hush of the river's meeting and the distant hum of men talking. The night sky stretched above them, stars winking in vast indifference to mortal struggles. Jon said a silent prayer to the old gods that the battles ahead might be kinder than the last, though he suspected the worst was yet to come. A day passed, then two. Riverrun's halls bustled with rebuilding efforts, funerals for the fallen, and quiet strategizing about Tywin Lannister's next move. Maester Vyman reported that Ned's fever remained at bay, though the wound in his leg was healing slowly. Ned could walk with the crutch short distances now, and he joined Robb for private councils, but the effort plainly exhausted him. Arya rarely left his side unless Jon or Ser Roderick coaxed her to practice stances in the yard. Meanwhile, captains patrolled the roads and fords around Riverrun, capturing the occasional Lannister scout. None had knowledge of Tywin's whereabouts. Some said Tywin was massing near the ruins of Harrenhal. Others claimed he was riding for the Golden Tooth to regroup. A few rumored that Lord Tywin was even riding to King's Landing to protect the new king from any possible Baratheon resurgence. The truth was uncertain. Jaime Lannister remained their greatest prize, locked in a tower cell now instead of that dog kennel. He had been interrogated politely by Ned and Robb, but gave little away except scorn. He demanded a parley to negotiate his release. Ned said such a parley might happen once their terms were sent to King's Landing. Jaime laughed, calling them fools for thinking Cersei would yield. The man seemed as cocksure as ever, but beneath his mockery, Jon sensed tension. Jaime was, after all, caged, and at the mercy of people who had every reason to hate him. At midday on the third day after the battle, a raven arrived from the twins. Catelyn Stark was returning at once, escorted by a Frey retinue. She had apparently brokered the final terms of Robb's betrothal to one of Walder Frey's daughters, ensuring a stable alliance. The entire North needed that crossing open. Robb grimaced at the news, though he put on a stoic face for the sake of his men. As if the burdens of war weren't enough, now he faced an unwanted betrothal. Jon sympathized but knew it was necessary. Catelyn arrived in the late afternoon with a dozen mounted Freys trailing behind her. She dismounted in the yard, her eyes immediately scanning the crowd until she spotted Robb, Ned, and Arya. She rushed to them, ignoring the protest of her own weariness. Arya flew into her arms, and Catelyn embraced her fiercely, tears in her eyes. Then she turned to Ned, who stood with his crutch. Her gaze flicked to his injured leg, and her expression filled with worry and relief in equal measure. "Ned," she said, voice trembling, "I feared the worst when news came that you rode into battle wounded." Ned's eyes softened. "I'm still here, Cat. The gods were kind." He braced a hand on her shoulder, and she leaned into him for a moment of quiet comfort. Then her gaze hardened as she looked past him to where Jaime Lannister's tower cell rose above the parapets. "You have the Kingslayer," she stated. "We do," Ned said. "He's our hostage, perhaps our best chance at freeing Sansa." Catelyn's mouth thinned. "He pushed Bran from that tower. I know it in my heart. But if he can secure Sansa's release..." She swallowed anger. "We must consider all possibilities." Robb stepped forward, hugging his mother. "You've done well at the twins, I take it?" He forced a tight smile. Catelyn sighed. "As well as can be expected. Lord Walder's demands are many. You know what's required of you, Robb." Robb nodded stiffly. "I do." He glanced away, jaw flexing. "I'll keep my word." Without the twins, our supply lines to the north vanish. Catelyn's gaze flitted to Jon, but she only gave him a curt nod. Jon saw in her eyes the old wariness. She had warmed a little after learning he wasn't Ned's actual bastard, yet it remained complicated. She knew the truth but seemed unsure how to treat him. Instead of addressing it, she said, "We have much to discuss, all of us. Shall we go inside?" They adjourned to the same large chamber used for councils. Ned settled on a cushioned chair, leg propped up, while Catelyn took a seat beside him. Robb stood by the fireplace, restless. Arya perched near Ned, as if refusing to be banished. Jon stood off to one side, arms folded. Around them gathered the lords of the north, the great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, Galbart Glover, Rickard Karstark, and Brynden Tully for the Riverlands. Ser Roderick Castle was there, two side whiskers bristling. After pleasantries, Catelyn recounted the final agreement with Lord Frey. "He will keep the twins open and supply us with grain and fodder for our mounts. In return, when the war is done, Robb shall marry Rosalind Frey, Lord Walder's daughter. Additionally, if Lord Walder demands it, Arya will spend a year as his ward, once she's older. We've left that vague, though," she added hastily, seeing Ned's face darken. "I doubt the old man truly cares for that arrangement as much as he does for binding our houses." Arya blurted, "I won't go to the twins." Catelyn raised a hand. "Hush, child. We will see. The arrangement was a last-minute demand by Walder Frey, but I suspect it's mostly for show. He wants to see the Starks under his roof, a sign of trust. It may never come to pass if the war ends quickly. Now, as for the timeline, Walder expects Robb's marriage to take place once the fighting concludes, assuming we're victorious." Robb's jaw clenched. "So be it." The great Jon bellowed, "A small price for crossing. We'll repay the Freys by holding their tower for them if the lions come knocking." A few men chuckled. Brynden Tully smirked but kept silent. Roose Bolton tapped a finger on the table. "All well and good. Now, my lords, we must address the matter of King's Landing. If we plan to send an envoy to bargain for Sansa's freedom, perhaps Lady Catelyn is the best choice." Ned stiffened in his seat. "I'd rather not risk Catelyn that way. The Lannisters have shown no qualms about capturing or threatening hostages. If I send her, we might lose both Sansa and my wife." Catelyn touched his arm gently. "Nor do I want to be taken again. We should consider a trusted retainer, someone who can speak for us but won't unravel everything if taken prisoner." Robb nodded. "What about Lord Bolton? Or the Blackfish? Or Ser Roderick?" The Blackfish, arms folded, shook his head. "I'm needed here to coordinate with the other river lords. Edmure's not fully well, and we can't rely solely on him. As for me riding to King's Landing, I doubt Cersei would open the gates for the man who helped lift the siege. Bolton's eyes flickered with an emotion akin to amusement. I doubt my presence would please the Lannisters. They consider me a rumor in the dark, a butcher. I suspect I'd be killed on sight. We need someone less polarizing. Ser Roderick cleared his throat. I am loyal, but I've no skill in the courts. Peter Baelish is there, among others. He is cunning, and I might be no match for his manipulations. A murmur of discontent spread as they realized no obvious candidate emerged. Then Brynden said slowly, "We could choose a small group of envoys, not just one man. A handful of lesser knights or even a maester. But would Cersei even grant an audience if we do not bring Jaime Lannister with us?" Ned frowned. "We're not giving Jaime to them without a firm exchange for Sansa. He's too valuable to risk losing. The moment we hand him over, they might deny any promise and keep Sansa anyway." Catelyn's lips pressed together. "Perhaps we hold Jaime here, but we send word that he will be executed if Sansa is harmed or if the negotiations fall through. Harsh, but that's how the Lannisters play this game. They must believe we'll do it." Karstark, who had lost 2 sons in earlier clashes, muttered, "We should do it anyway. He maimed your boy. If it were up to me, I'd stake him at the crossroads for all to see." Ned's voice was weary but firm. "Bran's injury weighs on me every day. Yet Jaime is our best lever. We do not kill him unless we have no other choice." Karstark accepted that with a stiff nod. Robb ran a hand through his hair. "So we pen a letter to the court at King's Landing, spelling out our demands. Return Sansa, cease hostilities, recognize the North's autonomy, or at least withdraw Lannister forces from the Riverlands, and we'll negotiate Jaime's release. If they refuse, we keep Jaime and push the war. That sums it up, yes?" Catelyn glanced at Ned. "Yes, that's the gist. But we must also consider that the King's Council might be divided. Some might push for war, others for peace. We can only hope they want Jaime alive enough to parley." The great Jon belched. "I say we present them a choice. The girl for the Kingslayer, or the boy king's beloved uncle loses his head. That's plenty persuasive. They'll come running to bargain." Amid the coarse agreement from a few lords, Ned's eyes strayed to Arya, who looked appalled by all this talk of hostages and decapitations. Gently, Ned motioned for her to leave the council. She glowered but obeyed, perhaps more rattled than she let on. Jon watched her go, thinking again how this war was shaping her. She'd always been fierce, but now her innocence was slipping away every day. His own was too. The lords continued hammering out the details. They agreed that Maester Vyman and a small retinue of Tully Knights would deliver the letter to King's Landing under a flag of truce. If Cersei's people permitted the Maester's entrance, negotiations could begin. If they refused, then the war would rage on, and Sansa's fate remained uncertain. By the time they concluded, the candles had burned low, and dusk was upon them. The men dispersed, some to check on their soldiers, others to find dinner or collapse into bed. Jon lingered behind with Robb, Ned, and Catelyn. Ned's face was drawn with fatigue, leg clearly aching. Catelyn knelt beside Ned's chair. "Let me help you to your bedchamber, my love." Ned offered her a tired smile. "That would be welcome." He struggled upright, leaning heavily on the crutch. Catelyn took one arm, Robb the other. Together, they guided him toward the corridor. Jon followed a step behind, overshadowed by their familial closeness. He still felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Gratitude for Ned, sorrow for Sansa, worry for Arya, guilt for his Targaryen blood. But outwardly he maintained composure. Ned paused before departing, turning to Jon. "You've done well, son. Get some rest. Tomorrow see that Jaime is checked on. We don't want him dying of neglect. He must be kept in shape for the negotiations." "Yes, father," Jon said. He bowed his head respectfully. Then he watched them go, the 3 of them supporting each other along the corridor. A pang of longing went through him. For the old days at Winterfell, when life was simpler, and he and Robb were just boys. Now, Robb bore the weight of an entire army, Ned was gravely wounded, and the realm stood on a precipice. Jon made his way to the courtyard, where the night air was cool. Soldiers sat by small fires, drinking and sharing tales of the battle. Some hailed Jon as he passed. He nodded back but kept going until he reached a corner near the stables, quiet and dark. A single guard posted near the stable door turned a curious glance at him, then looked away, uninterested. He sank down on a bench beneath a flickering torch. The ache in his side from Jaime's sword cut flared anew. He pressed a hand to it, remembering the Kingslayer's lethal grace. If Jaime had not been forced to check Ned's approach, Jon might have been dead. And yet, there was a wild satisfaction in having survived such a duel, a proof of his own skill. Maybe he was more than just a bastard with a wooden sword, but the other side of him whispered, Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, who had once been hailed as a noble prince. Did he carry that same capacity for valor, or was he cursed by the blood of madness that Aerys had displayed? The doubt gnawed at him. He often recalled Ned's assurance that he was no monster, that Rhaegar himself had not been like the Mad King. But fear was not so easily banished. He let the torch's flames hypnotize him, drawing shapes in the night. He thought of Daenerys Targaryen, rumored to be across the narrow sea, married to a Dothraki Khal, pregnant with the next Targaryen line. If the realm discovered Jon was also Targaryen, might they expect him to clash with Daenerys? Or to join her? The possibilities made his head spin. Footsteps approached from the gloom. He reached for his sword, but relaxed when he saw it was Ser Rodrik Castle, face grave. The old knight bowed. Jon, I hope to find you here. Are you all right, lad? Jon stood, bowing slightly in return. Just thinking, Ser Rodrik. Rodrik nodded. I worry for you, truly. You carry burdens heavier than your years. But I have faith in you and in the blood of House Stark in your veins. Do not despair. Jon's throat constricted. He said softly, Thank you. Then, feeling the stirrings of an urge to speak, he confided, Ser Rodrik, do you recall the day my father brought me to Winterfell as a babe? Rodrik's bushy brows rose. Though I was a younger man then, not so wise. I remember your father returning from the war, a bundle in his arms. We believed you were his by another woman. He commanded us not to question it further. Jon swallowed. He never spoke the mother's name to you? Rodrik shook his head. Never. He was adamant. Catelyn was upset, but it was not my place to pry. In time, she learned to accept your presence, though not warmly. He paused. Why do you ask, lad? Jon's gaze shifted away. No reason, truly. Just, I wonder if my mother might have died alone. The older man's face softened. I see. A harsh world, is it not? Rodrik put a hand on Jon's shoulder. We must cling to what family we do have, even if the past is full of secrets. You're a good lad, Jon. Don't let the rumors about your birth weigh you down. Jon forced a smile. I'll try. He truly appreciated Ser Rodrik's kindness, though the man had no clue of the deeper truth. Thank you for speaking with me. They stood in companionable silence a moment longer. Then Rodrik excused himself to check on some new prisoner arrivals. Jon let out a sigh and returned to the bench. The torch sputtered, throwing wild shadows. War battered them from one side, secrets from the other. But tomorrow, they'd continue step by step, forging alliances, drafting letters, hoping to reclaim Sansa, hoping not to provoke Tywin's wrath too soon. At length, Jon stood and headed back inside the keep, found a small chamber where a pallet awaited him. He sank into it, exhaustion racking his bones, only half aware of the flickering candle on the rough-hewn table. His mind reeled with images. Jaime's golden sword, Ned's pained face, Arya's haunted eyes, Robb's stoic resolve, the red fork soaked in blood. He dreamed of the crypts below Winterfell, cold and silent. A figure stood in the gloom, a woman with dark hair, her face blurred by shifting candlelight. She beckoned to him. He stepped closer, heart pounding, certain it was Lyanna Stark. But before he could speak, a dragon's roar echoed through the crypts, shaking the old tombs. He woke gasping, chilled with sweat, uncertain whether to fear or hope. Morning brought fresh bustle. Word came that a Lannister outrider had been spotted, presumably scouting for Tywin. Robb's men gave chase but lost him in the dense woods. The northern host readied for a possible confrontation, though days passed with no sign of Tywin's main force. Meanwhile, Ned composed a letter to the small council in King's Landing, demanding Sansa's safe return and recognition of the Riverrun's freedom from further raids, in exchange for Jaime's continued life. He placed the Stark seal upon it, then gave it to Maester Vyman, who departed under white flags with a small escort of Tully knights. Jaime Lannister remained locked in the tower, fed decent meals, his wound from the battle bandaged but left sore enough to remind him of captivity. Occasionally, he'd mock the guards or ask to see Ned Stark, which Ned refused, limiting visits to official interrogations. Jon checked on him twice, mostly to ensure the guards maintained civility. Ned would not allow torture or ill treatment. Jaime remained defiant, ironically praising the Starks for their softness, as he called it. Days edged into a week, and the tension in Riverrun only deepened. No replies came from King's Landing. Rumors trickled in that Tywin Lannister was marching at last, heading east from the Golden Tooth with a great host to crush the traitor Starks. Some said Tywin commanded nearly 20,000 men, more than Robb's entire force. Others spoke of a second Lannister force under the command of Lord Stafford or the Mountain Gregor Clegane. War was truly in full motion, yet Catelyn and Ned had a plan. If Tywin approached from the west, they could muster near Riverrun's walls, forcing a siege. Harrenhal might become a secondary front if the Lannisters used it as a base. Meanwhile, the newly titled Young Wolf had begun to attract reinforcements. Lords from the north trickled south with more men, having heard of the victory against Jaime. The tension was like a coiled spring. Arya asked each day if they'd heard from King's Landing, and each day they said no. She ground her teeth, furious that Sansa was left in peril. Jon found himself caught up in drill after drill, training the new arrivals, checking fortifications. He busied himself so he wouldn't dwell on the swirl of secrets. At night, he still dreamed sometimes of crypts, dragons, or glimpses of a distant tower with the scent of blue winter roses. He rarely mentioned such things to anyone, except to quietly confirm to Ned that the dreams persisted. Ned listened somberly but could offer little counsel. The war overshadowed all. Then, one cloudy afternoon, a fresh piece of news arrived that changed everything once again. A black raven from King's Landing, addressed to Ned Stark, soared in and landed on the tower coop. The letter bore the royal seal. A hush fell over the hall as Maester Vyman handed it to Ned in the presence of Robb, Catelyn, Arya, and Jon. Guards hovered, as did a cluster of lords. Ned broke the seal carefully, reading it with narrowed eyes. A muscle in his jaw flexed. "They respond at last," he said, voice tight. "They demand that we free Ser Jaime immediately and swear fealty to King Joffrey, or else Sansa's life is forfeit. They also threaten to name us rebels to the entire realm if we do not submit." Catelyn's face went white. They threaten Sansa's life?" Ned handed the parchment to her. His voice trembled with anger. "Yes, they call me an oathbreaker and a traitor. They say that if I do not come in person to King's Landing to bend the knee, they'll execute Sansa. They promise her head will be displayed on the walls for all to see." A collective gasp filled the hall. Arya made a choking sound. Robb cursed under his breath, fists tightening. Jon's heart hammered, imagining Sansa's terror. The great Jon roared, "Bastards! Let us ride for King's Landing and tear it down." Roose Bolton said coldly, "It might be a bluff, but can we risk it? The Lannisters are known for cruelty." Catelyn crumpled the letter in her hands, tears brimming in her eyes. "My poor girl. Ned, we can't let them kill her. We must do something. Trade Jaime for Sansa at once." Ned closed his eyes a moment. "If we do, they'll demand more. And there's no guarantee they won't harm her anyway once they have Jaime. They hold the advantage if they think we will yield to threats." Robb glared at the floor. "They want you in King's Landing, father, to kneel like a beaten dog. They want the Starks destroyed." This is blackmail. Catelyn looked at Ned, voice trembling. We can't just sacrifice her. Ned took a steadying breath, though his leg quivered with pain. No, we cannot. But neither can we walk into a trap. Tywin Lannister marches on us. If I ride south alone, I might be captured or killed, and they'd still have Sansa. We need a better plan. Arya whispered. They can't kill her. They can't. She looked half feral with desperation. Brynden Tully stepped forward, trying for calm. We must see if we can arrange a hostage exchange on neutral ground, or propose that Sansa be sent forth with minimal escort to prove they won't harm her. Then we release Jaime. But that would require good faith from them, and Cersei has given little reason to trust her word. The hall erupted in argument, lords shouting over each other. Some demanded immediate trade, others said it was a trap. Ned sat there, pale, a man torn between paternal love and the knowledge that these same foes had done far worse to the Targaryens in the past. He had sworn not to become a monster like they were. But if Sansa's life hung in the balance, Jon lingered at the edge of the gathering, fury burning in his chest. Sansa had always been proper and ladylike, never imagining a fate as horrifying as this. She'd believed in princes and songs. Now that very monarchy threatened her life. A swirl of helpless rage filled Jon. He wanted to draw his sword, to fight an enemy he could see. But the real enemy was a letter from far away, a serpent's threat. Robb called for order, raising his voice. Silence! Slowly, the lords obeyed. Robb turned to Ned. Father, you command us. What shall we do? Ned looked up, every line of him etched with sorrow. We must consider a deception. If we appear to comply but keep Jaime until we're certain Sansa is safe. Or we glean more from the capital. Perhaps we send a small band to King's Landing. Under disguised terms, verify Sansa's condition, and if all is well, we conduct an exchange. But can we find a path that ensures her survival? Catelyn sank to her knees by Ned's chair, tears slipping down her cheeks. Ned, do something. Please. I can't lose another child. Not like this. Ned pressed a hand over hers. We will do all we can, Cat. The Lannisters push us to desperation. But we'll push back. His voice grew steely. If they harm my daughter, the name Lannister will be cursed for 1,000 years. I swear it. The men in the hall bristled with outraged sympathy, calling curses on King Joffrey and Cersei. Arya stared at her father with raw hope, as if trusting him to conjure a miracle. Jon's heart ached, knowing how powerless they all were before the cruelty of a child king who'd already shown sadistic tendencies. He silently resolved that if Sansa was killed, he would never rest until the Lannisters were destroyed. It was a dark thought, and it frightened him to harbor such vengeful rage, but he embraced it nonetheless. Ned inhaled shakily. We'll convene in the morning with our captains. For now, keep Jaime under lock and key. Double the guard. Prepare for Tywin's approach. We must assume the worst but strive for the best. I won't let them snuff out Sansa's life. He gently clasped Catelyn's hand, meeting her eyes with fierce resolve. I won't. And so, as the dark clouds gathered outside Riverrun's walls, the Starks stood at another grim crossroads. The realm was in open war. King's Landing threatened Sansa's life. Tywin Lannister's armies marched somewhere out there, hungry for vengeance. Through it all, Ned clung to honor and love, Robb clung to leadership, Arya to anger and fear, and Jon to the quiet knowledge that he was the realm's hidden Targaryen, sworn to House Stark's cause. Winter loomed, and the Game of Thrones now demanded a toll heavier than any of them had ever imagined.